They laughed the moment they heard what I paid for that little strip of lakefront dirt. And honestly, if I hadn't spent the next month digging through 200 years of forgotten records, I probably would have laughed too. 6 weeks later, some of the wealthiest homeowners in Western North Carolina were calling me every hour, begging me to unlock a steel gate they never imagined someone else could legally own. My name is Ethan Carter. I make a living buying properties nobody else wants. Tax auctions, abandoned parcels, forgotten easements, pieces of land that look worthless until you ask one more question than everybody else. My wife likes to joke that I don't buy real estate. I buy other people's mistakes. She's probably right. Over the years, I'd flipped dozens of strange properties, an abandoned gas station, half a mountain nobody could reach without crossing federal land, even an old railroad easement that ended up being worth 10 times what I paid for it. So when I spotted a tiny quarter-acre parcel sitting beside Lake Hawthorne during a county tax sale, something about it caught my attention. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't buildable. It looked like nothing more than an overgrown gravel strip leading toward the water. Most investors skipped right past it because the listing photos were terrible and the tax description was barely 3 sentences long. Minimum bid was $3,400. Nobody raised a paddle except me. I signed the paperwork, wired the money, and honestly forgot about it for almost 2 weeks. Then one Thursday afternoon, while I was replacing deck boards behind another rental house, a black luxury SUV rolled into my driveway. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd ironed his khakis before putting them on. Clean haircut, polished loafers, expensive sunglasses, the kind of guy who smiled without ever letting it reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Richard Holloway, president of the Lakeside Ridge Homeowners Association. Before I could even invite him to speak, he pulled a folder from under his arm and handed me a letter from a downtown law firm. "Congratulations on your purchase," he said with a smile that somehow sounded insulting. "Unfortunately, you accidentally bought land that belongs with our community. These things happen." I glanced at the paperwork. They weren't asking to buy it. They weren't offering compensation. They wanted me to donate the parcel to the HOA immediately or prepare for litigation over what they called an encroachment issue. I looked back up and asked, "So, your first offer is that I give you my property for free?" He chuckled like I was missing the joke. "Trust me, Mr. Carter. You'll save yourself a fortune." Then he climbed back into his SUV and drove away before I said another word. I've learned something after years in real estate. Whenever someone rich is desperate to convince you something has no value, it almost always has tremendous value. I wasn't angry yet. Curious? Absolutely. That weekend, I drove to the county courthouse expecting to spend maybe an hour confirming the deed. Instead, 1 hour became 6. 6 became 2 days. By Monday morning, the clerk behind the records counter knew my coffee order before I even walked through the door. Her name was Linda. She'd worked there nearly 30 years, and somewhere around my 5th archive request, she leaned over the counter and smiled. "Honey," she said, "people don't spend this much time researching worthless land." I laughed. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." She disappeared into a climate-controlled archive room and came back carrying several oversized leather-bound survey books that hadn't been opened in decades. The pages smelled like old libraries and history museums. Ink had faded to brown. Survey lines had been drawn by hand long before highways, power lines, or subdivisions existed. At first, none of it made sense. Different family names, old timber routes, creek crossings that no longer existed. Then I noticed something repeating over and over. Every transfer of ownership mentioned a permanent access corridor leading to the original river channel, rights that could never be separated from the parcel itself regardless of future development. That sentence bothered me because Lake Hawthorne wasn't even a natural lake. It had been created by a hydroelectric project generations later. So why would an ancient property deed mention water access that survived future development? Linda saw me staring at the document and quietly pulled another file from the shelf. "If you're following that trail," she said, "you'll probably want this one too." That second folder changed everything. Sitting inside was a handwritten land grant signed nearly 180 years before the first luxury home was ever built around that shoreline. As I carefully unfolded the brittle paper, my heartbeat genuinely sped up. I remember whispering to myself, "There's no way," because if I was reading those legal descriptions correctly, that forgotten little tax auction lot wasn't valuable because of land itself. It was valuable because of something almost nobody living around that lake even knew still existed. I took copies of every document home that afternoon, spread them across my dining room table, and spent most of the night reading language that felt more like decoding a foreign language than reviewing property records. My wife, Rachel, walked in around 10 with 2 cups of coffee, looked at the mountain of papers, and just shook her head. "Tell me you didn't accidentally buy another haunted building." I smiled without looking up. "I'd actually prefer haunted right now. Ghosts are easier than lawyers," she laughed. But when she saw the expression on my face, she realized I wasn't joking anymore. The old land grant wasn't simply describing ownership of a tiny parcel. It established a perpetual access corridor to the original riverbank, and every later legal transfer preserved that access regardless of future changes to the surrounding landscape. When the hydroelectric project flooded the valley decades later, creating Lake Hawthorne, nobody had rewritten those rights. They simply built around them, assuming history had disappeared beneath the water. It hadn't. It had been waiting inside a dusty archive for someone stubborn enough to read it. Of course, I wasn't about to bet my future on my own interpretation, so the next morning I hired the best property rights attorney I could find. Her name was Melissa Grant, and she'd spent nearly 25 years handling easement disputes throughout the Carolinas. She listened quietly while I explained everything, flipping through the documents one page at a time without saying much. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and looked at me over the top of her glasses. "Either you've stumbled into one of the strangest property cases I've ever seen," she paused just long enough to make me nervous, "or you just bought the most valuable quarter-acre in this county." That wasn't exactly the kind of answer that helps you sleep. Over the next week, Melissa assembled a small team. We hired a licensed surveyor named Ben Lawson, whose job was to compare every historical survey with modern satellite mapping. They spent days walking the property, measuring old boundary markers, locating iron pins buried beneath decades of soil, and comparing everything against county GIS records. I tagged along whenever I could. Watching Ben work felt like watching an archaeologist uncover a forgotten civilization. Every faded stone marker he uncovered seemed to erase another assumption the HOA had built its confidence on. 3 days later, Ben called me while I was driving. "You need to get over here." There wasn't excitement in his voice. There was disbelief. When I arrived, he pointed toward a narrow gravel road leading down to the community marina. "This entire access road," he said, "sits inside the historical corridor tied directly to your parcel." I stared at him. "You're telling me every homeowner uses my land to reach the lake?" He nodded slowly. "Not just homeowners. Delivery trucks, maintenance crews, emergency vehicles. Every single person heading to that marina crosses property rights attached to your deed." I didn't say anything for almost a minute. My brain was trying to catch up with what my ears had just heard. Suddenly, Richard Holloway's visit made perfect sense. He hadn't come to intimidate me because the lot was worthless. He came because he already knew it wasn't. The HOA had simply assumed an ordinary investor would panic when threatened by lawyers and hand everything over before asking questions. Melissa's office immediately sent a preservation notice to the HOA, informing them that ownership rights were under legal review and that no construction, modification, or interference with the parcel would be tolerated. Their response arrived the next afternoon. 4 pages. Lots of legal language. Plenty of confidence. Almost no actual evidence. Richard even included a handwritten note at the bottom. "We encourage you to reconsider before legal costs become overwhelming." Rachel read it and rolled her eyes. "He's bluffing." I nodded. "Yeah, but rich people usually bluff because it works." We decided not to respond immediately. Instead, Melissa contacted the State Historical Records Office, requesting formal verification of the original grant and its surviving legal status. Bureaucracy usually moves slowly, but old property rights tied to public infrastructure apparently get everyone's attention. Within 10 days, we had confirmation that the original corridor had never been extinguished by statute, condemnation, or negotiated transfer. Melissa walked into the conference room carrying the official opinion letter like someone carrying a winning lottery ticket. She dropped it on the table, smiled for the first time since we'd met, and simply said, "Congratulations. They don't have a legal right to use your access." I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because my brain still refused to believe reality. "So what happens now?" she answered without hesitation. "Now you decide whether to negotiate or enforce your rights." I didn't rush into anything. Contrary to what people think, I wasn't looking for revenge. I actually drove through Lakeside Ridge several times over the next few days just watching families enjoy the neighborhood. Kids rode bicycles. Couples walked dogs. Older residents fished from the marina. Most of those people had absolutely no idea what their HOA board had tried to do behind closed doors. They weren't my enemies. Richard Holloway and the board had created this situation by assuming intimidation was cheaper than honesty. That distinction mattered to me, so before taking any action, Melissa drafted one final letter offering negotiations. We proposed discussing a permanent access agreement under reasonable commercial terms. Richard never responded. Instead, another attorney sent a notice threatening immediate litigation if I interfered with what they described as established community access. Melissa looked at me after reading the letter. Well, they just made your decision easier. Construction began the following Monday. We installed a heavy-duty steel security gate across the legally defined entrance corridor. Every permit was approved. Every inspection passed. Cameras recorded every hour of installation because Melissa expected someone would eventually accuse us of wrongdoing. The gate itself wasn't flashy. Matte black steel, commercial-grade hinges, electronic keypad, emergency override for first responders, and enough concrete beneath the posts to survive a hurricane. Curious neighbors stopped to ask what we were building. I smiled politely and told them the truth. A property improvement. Word spread quickly. Richard drove by twice during installation without stopping. The third time he pulled over. He walked toward me wearing that same practiced smile I'd seen weeks earlier. This seems unnecessary, I shrugged. Protecting private property usually is, until it isn't. He folded his arms. You're making a mistake. I looked directly at him. No, Richard. Your mistake was assuming I wouldn't read my own deed. For the first time since we'd met, the smile disappeared. He climbed back into his SUV without another word. The gate became operational early Monday morning. At precisely 7 o'clock, I entered the security code, watched the steel arms slide together with a deep mechanical hum, and locked the only legal access route connecting Lakeside Ridge to the marina below. Then I drove home, poured myself a cup of coffee, and waited. It took less than 45 minutes. My phone rang. Unknown number. Then another. Then another. By 9 o'clock, social media pages for the subdivision were exploding with confusion. Residents couldn't launch boats. Marina employees couldn't receive fuel deliveries. Contractors were turning around at the gate. Charter fishing trips were being canceled. Around lunchtime, helicopters from 2 local television stations began circling overhead after someone tipped off the news. Every hour, the pressure increased. Realtors reported buyers walking away from pending contracts after learning lake access had suddenly become uncertain. Luxury homes advertised as waterfront lifestyle properties were now missing the very feature that justified their price tags. Richard called 14 times that day. I didn't answer once. Melissa handled every communication. When their attorneys finally demanded emergency access, she emailed back exactly 3 attachments: the original land grant, the certified historical opinion, and the modern survey proving continuous ownership. Then she added one sentence: my client remains willing to discuss a commercial lease under mutually acceptable terms. 2 days later, the State Historical Records Office publicly confirmed the validity of the documents. That announcement changed everything. Overnight, the story stopped being a neighborhood dispute and became statewide news. Reporters described it as one of the most unusual property rights cases anyone could remember. By Friday evening, homeowners who had never heard my name a week earlier were demanding answers from their HOA board, while Richard Holloway was suddenly discovering something far more dangerous than losing an argument with me. He was losing the trust of the very people who had elected him. By the beginning of the second week, Lakeside Ridge wasn't talking about landscaping standards or neighborhood cookouts anymore. Every conversation revolved around one question: how did our own HOA let this happen? Residents packed the clubhouse until people were standing in the hallways. Voices echoed through the parking lot before the meeting even started. Some blamed me without knowing the facts. Others blamed Richard Holloway for trying to strong-arm a stranger instead of simply picking up the phone and negotiating like an adult. I stayed home that night, but Melissa attended on my behalf. She called afterward and laughed softly. I've never seen a board meeting turn into a firing squad that fast. Apparently, homeowners weren't upset because someone owned the access corridor. They were furious because their own board had known there was a potential legal issue for years and chose intimidation over transparency. One former board member even admitted they'd discussed purchasing the parcel quietly long before the tax auction, but never wanted homeowners to know there might be an ownership problem. Instead, they gambled that whoever bought it could be scared into giving it away. That gamble had just become the most expensive decision in the history of the community. Over the next several days, the phone finally stopped ringing every 5 minutes. Instead, one call came through that actually mattered. Richard. I answered this time. His voice sounded completely different from the man who'd stepped out of that black SUV a month earlier. Gone was the confidence. Gone was the polished arrogance. All that remained was exhaustion. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "I'd like to discuss a solution." I leaned back in my chair and looked out toward my backyard for a moment before answering. "Richard." I offered a solution before any of this happened. There was a long silence before he finally admitted. "You did." We agreed to meet 2 days later inside a neutral conference room downtown. No cameras, no reporters, just attorneys, survey maps, financial analysts, and stacks of documents covering nearly every inch of the table. Richard looked 10 years older than when we'd first met. At one point, he rubbed his forehead and said something I'll probably never forget. "I honestly believed you were just another investor trying to make a quick flip." I smiled politely. "And I honestly believed a homeowners association would know who actually owned the property they depended on every day." Nobody laughed. The negotiations lasted almost 11 hours. They argued about valuation. We argued about legal precedent. They argued about fairness. Melissa calmly reminded everyone that fairness would have been offering to buy the parcel before threatening lawsuits. Eventually, emotions gave way to math. Without guaranteed lake access, property values would continue falling. Insurance companies were already asking questions. Pending sales had collapsed. Lenders were becoming nervous. Fighting me for years in court wasn't just risky. It was financially reckless. Late that evening, Richard slid a legal pad across the table. "Tell us your terms." I'd spent days thinking about that question. Revenge would have been easy. Permanently locking the gate would have satisfied a lot of people watching the story online. But I wasn't interested in destroying 900 families because a handful of board members made terrible decisions. Most residents had done absolutely nothing wrong. So I made an offer built around accountability instead of punishment. The community would receive guaranteed long-term access under a formal lease. Every homeowner would contribute a monthly access fee through the HOA. My legal expenses would be reimbursed in full. The agreement would include automatic penalties for missed payments, and every invoice would clearly identify exactly what the money represented. Lake access lease, Carter property rights. There would never again be any confusion about who owned what. The room went quiet while everyone reviewed the numbers. After another hour of revisions, signatures finally began appearing one after another. Richard signed last. His hand paused for just a second before the pen touched the paper. I couldn't help remembering the grin he'd worn when he first told me to donate my land for free. Funny how confidence changes once facts enter the conversation. The steel gate reopened the following morning. Boats rolled toward the marina again. Children went back to fishing off the docks. Life slowly returned to normal, except one thing had changed forever. Every single month, without fail, a payment arrived exactly on schedule. The memo line always carried the same words: lake access lease, Carter property rights. I never asked for that wording. Their attorneys insisted on it because clarity prevents lawsuits. And after everything that happened, nobody wanted another surprise hidden inside an old property file. A few months later, I bumped into Linda, the courthouse clerk who'd handed me those dusty archive books. She smiled the moment she saw me. "So," she asked, "was it worthless land after all?" I laughed. "Turns out it was the most expensive shortcut in the county." She shook her head and smiled. History has a funny way of waiting for the right person to read it. I think about that conversation more often than you'd expect, because this story was never really about beating an HOA. It wasn't about embarrassing rich people or making headlines. It was about something much simpler. Never assume the loudest person in the room knows more than the quiet one who's willing to do the homework. Sometimes the biggest advantage isn't money, influence, or a team of lawyers. Sometimes it's spending one more afternoon in an old courthouse reading documents everyone else ignored. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have kept that gate closed until every homeowner paid the price for their board's actions? Or would you have done exactly what I did and negotiated a deal that protected your rights while giving the community a second chance? Let me know down in the comments, because I've seen people argue both sides of this story. And honestly, I can understand why. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who believes property rights don't matter until the day they suddenly do. Trust me, sometimes a few forgotten pages in an old courthouse can change everything.